Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be joining us from. Thanks for coming in for another episode of the ABAP Freak Show. This is episode number 3, where we're going to look at the setup of a local development environment for doing Kubernetes development, specifically on a Windows development laptop using Minikube, Hyper-V, and Kyma. So, first of all, you might be wondering, a show named ABAP Freak Show, why are we talking about Kubernetes based development? Well, I did warn everybody in the very first episode that although I was using the historic name of ABAP Freak Show, that I was basically going to cover whatever I happen to be working on. And I work on a lot of different things. That's one of the things I love about working in the developer advocacy team, is that one week I might be doing some ABAP development, next week HANA, CAP, Kubernetes, Cloud Native. You never know what's going to come along. And likewise, the show, I'm going to bounce between a lot of different topics. And I thought it was a good point. We've done some ABAP content. We did some HANA CAP content with the introduction of the HANA Cloud. The new HANA Cloud. I thought this was a good time to also mix in some Kubernetes here, and like I said, we'll bounce around between a lot of different topics, right? So I thought, today is mostly about getting started, right? And what better place to get started than let's level set a little bit on terminology and what are we talking about here? First of all, Kubernetes-based development. It's hard to read anything in the industry without bumping across the term Kubernetes. Pretty big topic, and I think we have to kind of compare and contrast it to some of the things that maybe we're already familiar with when it comes to cloud-based development, namely Cloud Foundry. That's the main technology that we're using today in the SAP Cloud Platform. And if you do some HANA on-premise development and you've done some XSA, then you basically got a feel for Cloud Foundry as well. The idea with Cloud Foundry is that you have a little bit more abstraction, a little bit more opinionation about your cloud native development. You have the concept of build packs, which basically supply you with a small set of pre-configured environments. So you're not having to configure like a Linux VM, you're not having to configure the Node.js runtime settings or Java. You get a few settings that maybe you can control, like maximum memory and things like that, but a lot of the technical decisions about the environment are made for you. Now, to contrast that to Kubernetes, Kubernetes is less opinionated, I would say, than Cloud Foundry. It's kind of like dropping down another level. And for instance, instead of having build packs that you deploy your application in, you're often creating Docker containers, and you have complete control over the environment that you're setting up in order to deploy your application in. And that can have pros and cons. More power but more responsibility kind of situation. So it's good to have a variety of options. It's what we hear from our customers. It's what we like at SAP as well. And what we're seeing now is really a sliding scale of options. When you're doing cloud development, we can start at one end with extreme opinionation, and that's really the ABAP runtime on the cloud platform, where many of the technical decisions about the environment are made for you, and you can focus almost totally on the business logic of what you want to accomplish. Then in the middle, you've got Cloud Foundry, and you've got the Cloud Application Programming Model, CAP, which is opinionated yet more open than, say, compared to the ABAP environment, where you can plug in multiple languages and external libraries and things like that much more simply. Technical decisions are somewhat made for you, but not completely. And then the far end of the spectrum, more of the what people might term the pure cloud native, low level Kubernetes, and there's already been announcements that soon we'll have a managed Kubernetes environment in the cloud platform as well. And I think we'll see some hybrid there where Cloud Foundry actually runs on top of Kubernetes over time. But you'll have this choice of how much opinionation do you want in your runtime environment. And that really brings us to the topic that we want to do today, which is an introduction to that lowest level. How can you as a developer, with minimal investment, how can you get started learning Kubernetes in general, and more specifically, Kyma, which I haven't really talked about yet. Kyma being an SAP sponsored open source project, and also something that we're going to offer as a part of the cloud platform as well, as an alternative runtime that gives you low-level access to Kubernetes-based development, but also packages in a lot of popular open source third-party libraries and modules to round out the Kubernetes development experience. And then, of course, we supply not just those. We don't just redistribute those open source libraries, but we add some glue in there, some connective tissue, some administrative tools to make it easier to operate this Kubernetes environment, but more importantly, to develop in this Kubernetes environment, to take care of some of the more complicated aspects of Kubernetes-based development, things like Istio sidecars, being able to protect your services, put almost like a little proxy in front of them, and allow all the access to go through that proxy so that you can scale better your individual services, eventing. These are some of the things, the unique value proposition of Kyma. They bring in all these different parts and make it work well in this environment for you. But enough talking for now. I mean, there's plenty of other resources that you can go and read about Kyma. I'm going to do some, in future ABAP Freak shows, I'm going to do some more hands-ons with Kyma. But I really thought before we get into that, we've got to get an environment set up that we can work in as developers so that we can explore. And then we can start learning more of the unique features of it and things like that. So if you want to start your building your own environment, and like I said, I'm on a Windows desktop. That's my situation. I'm using Hyper-V, Microsoft Hyper-V for my virtualization technology. I've done some blogs on how I set up Hyper-V on my development landscape. I did that a couple weeks ago. If you're interested, check out my most recent blogs on the SAP Community Network. But that's sort of my starting point here. I've got Hyper-V, I've got Windows, and I want to get to the point that I have Kyma. And that's really can be your starting point here. If you go to the Kyma homepage, so that's where I am here, kymaproject.io, and I'll just start with the installation instructions. There's some very nice instructions here. I want to install Kyma locally, so I'll go to that option. It does a nice job of gathering the hardware requirements and the various prerequisites that you're going to need to install Kyma. Now it lists here for Mac OS, HyperKit driver, Linux, VirtualBox. Like I said, I'm doing this on Windows. I've actually tried this a couple different ways on Windows. I was originally using VMware. Yeah, the VMware Docker experience is a little unofficial. Let's put it that way. And that was part of the reason why I moved to Hyper-V, because I get a better, more official experience with Docker and with Minikube as well. And that's what we're gonna base things on here today. Let me grab a couple of these things from my other window. There we are. I've got my command window here. I tried to make my font nice and large so that hopefully everybody can read it, but it might be a little bit of a struggle to get everything on the screen here as well. But we're going to need a couple of prerequisite things on here. And first of all, Docker. All right, you're going to need a local Docker development environment. Certainly, with doing Kubernetes-based development, you need to be able to build your Docker containers, publish them, because that's largely what we're going to be deploying when we deploy our application. So, unlike say doing Cloud Foundry-based development, where you might build an MTA, an MTAR, and then deploy that MTAR, here we're going to have a configuration file for our deployment, much like the MTA. In fact, it's going to be YAML based as well, but the actual objects that we're deploying, the applications, are going to be packaged as Docker containers, and then we'll just reference those Docker containers. So we obviously need a Docker development environment to work here, and what I have is I just installed Docker Desktop. Nothing too amazing here. I don't want to go into all the details of setting up Docker, although it was relatively easy, at least in the Windows environment. I just downloaded the installer for Windows and ran it. You see, I don't have a whole lot running here in Docker right now, but I've got enough to get started. And I'll go ahead and bring over my Hyper-V manager. You can see that Docker Desktop did create its own VM. Did that during the installation process, and maybe if you're peeking ahead here to a little bit later, you'll see I actually already have Minikube running. We'll come back to that. Don't be confused by seeing that. You wouldn't see that at this point. If you've just installed Docker, you would just see the Docker Desktop at this point. I'm going to do this demonstration a little bit cooking show style, because I want to be able to demonstrate the end product and steps along the way. I've prepared some videos actually of some of the installation process that sometimes takes 5 or 10 minutes. I didn't want us sitting here watching wait times, but I wanted to be able to demonstrate the finished product as well. So I'm going to do a little bit, like I said, what I call cooking show magic, where they mix up all the ingredients, they throw it in the oven, and then immediately from a different oven they pull out the finished product. That's kind of what I'm going for here today. That's the first prerequisite, is we need Docker. We've got that taken care of. We need the Kyma CLI, the command line interface. This does the installation of Kyma, as well as it provisions your Kubernetes environment as well, and makes all the configuration changes and adjustments to your Kubernetes environment needed for Kyma. So pretty helpful tool. This one's really pretty straightforward as well. You can go to the Kyma project page, and then you can go to releases and just download the version for your environment. It's a zip file. I unzip it. I put it somewhere in my path. I've got a little folder that I already have set up in my path for utilities like this that I want in my path. So I downloaded that earlier, put it in my path, and here I can come to the command line now, and I can say, for instance, Kyma version, and it'll run the command line tool, and it's showing you that yes, I'm running version 1.11 patch 1, which is the latest available. At this point, if you just downloaded Kyma and you ran this command, Kyma version, you would see your CLI version. You would not have a cluster version. It would try to connect to a local cluster, a local server implementation. It would not find it because we haven't installed it yet. So once again, remember, I'm doing this cooking show style where I've already finished the installation, but we're kind of walking through the process as it would be anyway. So don't be confused if you vary a little bit there. The other thing that I'm going to point out at this point, I actually did a complete video of the whole installation process on Friday when I did this. And I'm going to release that on YouTube right after the live stream as well. And all I did, I've recorded the entire process end to end, including all the wait times and stuff like that, but I did trim down the wait timer. So like when I'm waiting for something to download, you don't have to watch the whole experience. I think it compressed down to, less than 20 minutes to do this whole thing end to end. So I will release that as well if you want to see the whole process in a clean environment where nothing has been installed in advance. I will release that video also. So we have our Kyma prerequisite. What else do we need here? It says we need kubectl. Okay, that is the Kubernetes command line tool that you use to administer Kubernetes directly. One of the most common tools that people use when they interact with Kubernetes. And what we want there, and I want to check off my list, make sure I get everything right here. I actually already have this installed as well. If I do kubectl version, we'll see the version that we have, and because I already have the Kubernetes server, once again, it's also telling me the server version that I have installed locally. You would not see that initially if you just installed kubectl. Now, there's different ways that you could install kubectl. You could, for instance, I used to install it by installing the Google Cloud SDK, and that would pre-install kubectl as well. But I got to the point where I wanted a little bit more control over the versions of kubectl and wanted to be able to install it standalone. So what I've started doing in my Windows environment, separate from this topic of Kubernetes development or Kyma, is I've started using Chocolatey, just in general to help download and manage software on Windows. This is a package manager for Windows. So if you've used, say, Homebrew on Mac OS, or you've used NPN for doing node development, this gives you very much the same kind of experience in managing software in a package manager kind of way, a very easy way to install and manage the versions of the software that's installed and the dependencies and things like that. So I found that it is a really great tool for installing software on Windows. And much of these utilities that you find here and prerequisites that you need for doing Kubernetes development in general, doing node development, various command line tools, they're available here in Chocolatey. And what I want to do now is like I said, I've got these videos prepared. And because I already have this installed and I didn't want to mess up my installation here, I've got my timestamp here. Let's go right here to 4:30. I want to show you what the original installation of kubectl looked like. So I just went to the command line. You type the choco command. That's the shortcut for Chocolatey. You say you want to install something. And the first time I said, well, install kubectl. So it goes out to the Chocolatey repositories, and it actually doesn't find kubectl. And that's one of the things that you'll find here is not all the package names necessarily match the utility name, like in this case, kubectl. That's not the package name. So I had to go to the Chocolatey repository and search, and I found that the package name was actually Kubernetes-CLI. So I instead install Kubernetes-CLI. Run the post-installation scripts, and then what you'll see here in a second is that I'll have the kubectl utility available. Okay. So now that we have kubectl available, you can see I can run the same version command that I did just now from my command line. It's taking a little bit longer because it's trying to see if I have a Kubernetes cluster installed locally, a server installation. So it takes just a little bit longer while it waits for that to time out. But then you see, yes, unable to connect. And actually, this took a little bit longer because I actually had some configuration left over from a previous install, and it was still trying to communicate to that Kubernetes cluster, even though I had already deleted it so I could record this demo. Okay. So what we have so far, we have the Docker environment for managing Docker containers. We've got the Kyma CLI for installing the Kyma software itself and all the supporting open source libraries and all the utilities for eventing and sidecar microservices and functions as a service and all the functionality that comes with Kyma. And we've installed the command line tool to allow us to interact with Kubernetes itself. The next thing that we need to install is Minikube. Now you might ask, well, what is Minikube then? Minikube is a lightweight local development version of Kubernetes. Okay, so this is primarily designed for developers who want to learn or develop locally before they deploy to a cloud-based server cluster. Great little tool. I mean, as much as the cloud has taken over the world, it's funny how developers cling to our local installations. We like that level of control, right? We like to do everything ourselves locally. We like to have our local copy of the server software and run a completely local environment. And Minikube is the way that we can do that to give us an entire Kubernetes server on our local machine. It would be like the equivalent of having your own Cloud Foundry running on your local machine. That's basically what we're going to set up here is the whole server environment that allows us to deploy microservices and serverless functions and configure eventing, but all on our local laptop. Now, we need to first install Minikube. And there's a link here to the instructions of how to install Minikube. Once again, I'm going to use Chocolatey for my installation. There are different installation options based upon different OS options you can follow through from the Kubernetes Minikube website to get those different instructions. But one thing I'm going to point out here is the version number of Minikube needs to match up to the requirements of Kyma, because Kyma is going to interact really closely with the underlying Kubernetes environment. So it's very important, I've found, to match up that version exactly. Being a typical developer, when I first started working with Kyma, I saw the prerequisites and it listed, Minikube version XYZ, as you see here, and I immediately thought, oh, I know better. I like to run the latest of everything. I'm going to run the latest version of Minikube. I'm not going to take the version that they specifically tell me to. And I learned real quick that things didn't work out so well when I did that. So what I would start off doing here is, I would install Minikube and I would use the version that they specifically asked me to use, 1.3.2. Now, what I found out the other day when I did that, there actually is no version 1.3.2 of Minikube. I believe that this is a typo in the installation instructions. And I proved this out by going ahead and installing the latest version of Minikube. And then when I started installing Kyma, it actually, at that point, like it does the first checks against Minikube as it starts to install into Minikube, it says, you're not running the right version, you need version, and it said, and this is specific to Kyma 1.11, it said you need version 1.6.2. So that's where I believe this is a typo. I believe that this should be 1.6.2 because that version, first of all, does exist, and I installed with it, and the Kyma installer no longer complained when I got to that point, once I uninstalled everything and reinstalled Minikube 1.6.2. And then, of course, my installation works as well. So those are three pieces of information that would seem to indicate that this information is incorrect and that you actually need 1.6.2. So once again, to install Minikube, I would just use the command line, the choco command. And let me jump ahead to that point here in my video. I already have it installed on my machine, so I can't do it again. But I want a very particular version. And if you do a choco command, just like npm or other package managers, and you don't specify a version, then you're automatically going to get the latest version, right? And I didn't want that. I want a very specific, slightly older version. So when I come here to do the command, you'll notice choco install minikube -- version, and then I specify the specific version number that I want. and then it will pull down that 1.6.2 version for me. So once again, that version numbers are very important, and unfortunately it does appear that's a typo on the installation page, that it's 1.6.2 for the latest version. Now, I have installed Minikube. I don't actually have Kubernetes running yet at this point. All I've done is brought down the executables to run Kubernetes. I have not created a server cluster yet. So there's nothing to connect to. There's no server software really running yet. It's like I've just prepared the server installation at this point. If I now want to provision a server, there are Minikube commands that you could run that would set up a Kubernetes cluster. But we're actually not going to use the built-in Minikube functionality to build a Kubernetes cluster. We're going to use Kyma. Kyma has its own command line tool we've seen. So let me jump ahead to this point. 1 second here. We're going to use that Kyma command line tool, and there is a command, Kyma provision, and that will start the Minikube installer for you and do all the necessary setup so that it works right with Kyma. So we're going to say Kyma provision Minikube. We have to tell it which VMware driver we want to use, which VM driver we want to use, not VMware, which VM driver. And I'm using Hyper-V, so I tell it Hyper-V. And then specific to if you're using Hyper-V, you have to tell it which network virtual switch you want it to use. You can have multiple network interfaces, local only, external, NATs. I'm using external because I want my Kyma cluster and Kubernetes in general to be able to connect to the internet. So I have to specify which virtual switch that I want. If you're not sure where that's coming from, I can come over here to my virtual switch manager, and you see these are the network switches that were created. See, external is just giving me access to the internet. So that is the switch that I want Kubernetes to use, the network device. And now Kyma is doing all the setup of Kubernetes, or more specifically Minikube in this case. It's actually creating another VM instance in Hyper-V, and it's installing some base content into that. You can see it's starting up some additional services here, and I have compressed this video for time. I've cut out all the wait times, but this actually took maybe 10 minutes to do when I did the original recording, and a lot of that is just watching the clock as it downloads components and installs them. But at this point, I have Kubernetes running on my local laptop, and I could do things like I could come back to the command line here. For instance, I could say Minikube IP, and it will give me the IP address that my Minikube instance is running on. That's actually the IP address of assigned to my VM. Or I could do, for instance, Minikube dashboard. And when I do that, give it a second to start up, it will launch a Kubernetes administration dashboard. I can see things like, well, which pods have I deployed? Pod is very much like a service in Cloud Foundry, or an application in Cloud Foundry. It's a single thing that I developed or downloaded, and it's the running version of that. So there's not a whole lot in here yet because this is an empty system. All we really have are the bare system utilities, like the brokers, the event bus, things like that installed on the system. You will see, now keep in mind, you're seeing my live system now, not the one that I did in progress. I've already installed all of Kyma as well. When you first come in here, you would not see all these additional Kyma and Knative namespaces with the content that Kyma has installed. You would just see like Kube System, Default, and Kubernetes Dashboard. So just the bare bones Kubernetes components. But at this point, I have a Kubernetes development environment. I could do bare bones Kubernetes development. I could start deploying my own Docker containers and create and run microservices in Kubernetes on my local laptop at this point right here, right? But I want to go a step further, and I want to add the Kyma project on here as well. And I noticed somebody asked in the chat, what is Kyma? And just so everybody's clear, this is not ABAP. We have the ABAP runtime, we have the Cloud Foundry runtime, and now we have the Kyma runtime, all under the umbrella of the cloud platform. This is already used, as someone mentioned, this is already used in the C4 or CX, as it's now called, in the former CRM products, as its technical foundation. But this is another runtime that's going to be available to you in general in the SAP Cloud Platform to be able to create or migrate over your own really cloud-native applications, low-level cloud-native applications that are built for Kubernetes, but provide all these additional services. You see Knative, you see Istio. These are, if you're a little familiar with the Kubernetes environment, these are popular, open-source, additional libraries, capabilities that people have developed and added to Kubernetes. And what Kyma does is it packages all those things together so that with one installer, we can get all the best of all these pieces and parts that are out there in the industry, assemble them in a way that they all work together and provide us a runtime platform for deploying Kubernetes applications designed to take advantage of this functionality. In many cases, greatly simplify the ability to develop and consume things like Istio. Now, in today's stream, I don't have time to go into all the details of Istio and Knative, but maybe in some future videos as we start to develop in the Kyma environment, we'll point out what some of those things are. For now, it's just good to know that these are all these standards-based things. A lot of people outside of the SAP ecosystem are already developing in this kind of environment, and here we are trying to be as open as possible, bring it into the SAP Foundation, but as you'll see later, also show you how it can easily integrate with other runtimes, the ABAP and the Cloud Foundry-based runtimes as well. So this is all about creating choice of the runtimes, but also the ability to bridge them together so that they're not all islands. So to answer Uwe's question, CX, customer experience, was the most recent rename for C4 HANA. So I think that was last year, Sapphire, they started referring to it as CX, customer experience. So we're ready now to do the last step, which is to install Kyma. Oh, actually, I almost forgot. There's one other tool that I want to go ahead and install. It's not listed here in the prerequisites and not technically a prerequisite for installing Kyma itself, but one that I find I need right away when I start doing development, and that's Helm. Helm is mentioned here in the documentation, and certainly if you start doing some of the Kyma tutorials, you'll see Helm as well. Helm is like a package manager for Kubernetes. So I kind of, and I know this isn't a perfect comparison, but I think of it, I tend to draw correlations back to Node.js development because that's what I do a lot of. To me, Helm is kind of like NPN is to Node.js development. So that you don't have to always go and find all the Docker containers for published components that you want to install. Helm has what they call charts, and I find that naming a little odd. I mean, all this nautical Kubernetes uses all this nautical terminology and naming, but so Helm has something called charts. In my mind, these are like packages. It's really kind of like a package manager. And I'm sure someone will comment later, oh no, it's nothing like that because of this. But to me, to the end result, it helps me go bring additional components into my Kubernetes environment in general. I want to go ahead and install it as well. So once again, I already have it installed, so I can't install it again here, so I'm going to refer back to my video. Let's jump to the right time code for it, 1540. And once again, I'm going to use Chocolatey. I'm going to use the choco command. I just love saying choco. And once again, it's a command that doesn't match the package name, and choco does not match the command name. The command name is Helm, but once again, the package name is Kubernetes-Helm. And once again, we want to be very specific with our version. The current version of Helm is 3.x version, but all the tutorials that I've been going through with Kyma are all using the 2.x version, and from everything I've seen and read, there's quite a bit of difference between Helm 2 and Helm 3, and when I tried to do the tutorials using Helm 3, I did not match it at all. It was not a good experience. So I went back to Helm 2, and then everything matched up nicely with the Kyma tutorials that I was going through there. So little another tip if you're going to work through the Kyma specific tutorials that are published on the Kyma project page, then you want to go grab Helm version 2 there. Okay. Let's see. I'll just check the questions real quick. Like I said, the Kyma package is a lot of tools you need. Okay, that's what we've been talking about. That won't work. I'm not sure what that won't work was referring to. I'm not sure how the timestamp matched up to what I was just talking about. I don't know if you're referring to the Helm install or the fact that I was talking about Helm 3. So hopefully I've addressed what you said there. If not, feel free to post something additional, and I'll address it there in the chat. But otherwise, we're at the point where we actually want to do the Kyma installation. And this may seem slightly anticlimactic at this point after we've done all these prerequisites. We've got a great environment. It turns out it's one simple command, Kyma install. But that's part of what's great about this. Let's once again switch over to the video because I've already got this prepared. Oh, you're talking about my typo? Yes, I did misspell install the first time and then went back and corrected it. Yeah, trying to even in the pre-recorded video that I did of this keep the live stream experience, including all the typos in there, right? So let me jump ahead here, find my spot. So we are just going to go back to the command line. We're going to do the Kyma install command. And you'll see kicks off. It runs. It's checking the configuration of Minikube and the environment, checking to make sure that we have our prerequisites, that they match the versions that Kyma is expecting. So now it's pulling down the sources that it needs, and it's going to be off to the races here. Yeah, give it a second. I did cut out most of the wait times, but I think I was probably talking at this point in the original video as well, so maybe that's why I didn't cut quite much. All right, we're going to see a bunch of different things get installed here. It's configuring Minikube. It's configuring a Helm server. Actually, installing the Kyma installer is installing Kyma. All right. And now what we see here is all these third-party open source components being downloaded and installed. So I'll point out some Istio, Knative. These are, and I encourage you, if you're interested in Kubernetes development in general, Kyma development specifically, these are good things to research. They didn't come from SAP. They've come from the community. Sometimes we contributed back to some of these open source projects. And like I said, in future videos, maybe we'll look at the functionality that some of these important components provide. But the thing to take away now is Kyma's getting them all for you and configuring them all. You even see here, this is one that I say, the K-Navy eventing actually probably failed. Maybe I had a network timeout or something. I actually found as I was recording the video, the recording software was taking up a lot of my CPU and causing the installation to take quite a bit longer than normal. I believe that's why this one component timed out. But if you notice, it tried again, and then it got it the second time. So pretty resilient installer there. And just go through the rest here. It won't take too long. It's downloading and installing the rest of the components. And you see, this would be this is much simpler than if you had to go out and get all these components yourself, either from various open source projects, different Helm charts, different Docker containers, getting them installed in the right order, configuring them to talk to each other. This is what Kyma is doing for you. It's doing all that work for you. So with the one command, you've got this great, robust Kubernetes-based environment with all these best practice components ready to use, and far simpler than if you were to do this all yourself, believe me. Next, it's done. It's at the very end. It wants to know, do you want to install the root certificate? Basically, it's very much like if you've ran XSA, like HANA Express on your local machine, you know you have the option of host name-based routing. Well, Kyma also uses host name-based routing and self-signed certificates. So, because it's a local development environment, we want to say yes, fine, use self-signed certificates. It will automatically inject them into your root certificate store so that when you connect from a browser locally on my development machine, it will be trusted. That's very nice. We used to have to add those certificates manually, but now the Kyma installer will add those in as well. So I'll say, yes, I do want you to install the root certificate so I don't have to mess around with the certificates. That's very nice. And then you'll also see here in a second that it is done. Now on Windows and in other environments, we're going to have to edit our host file. Because like I said, we're using host name-based routing, which means instead of a different port for each service that's running in a microservice environment, it's installed many services, we need to configure a different host name to go to that service. And because this isn't a public server, this is just a local development server, we're not going to have a DNS or domain name service with a wildcard. That's what you would do for a public server. You would create a wildcard DNS entry so everything would get directed back to the service. But we can work around that in our local development environment simply by, on Windows at least, editing the host file. And simply adding these entries that it's given you here, so you just cut and paste these from the console here into your host file. It even tells you where to go find your host file in your environment, so the installer's done a lot of work for us. And just map the IP address to these various service names. And that's going to take the place or override your domain name service and route you automatically to the correct service. We'll see here some other important information. So it's telling you the URL of the console. You're going to want to log in and do some post-installation steps, administer your system. It's got your initial email, and it's got your initial password. All right? So at this point, all my pre-recorded videos have just caught up with where my system is at this point. And I can go ahead and go to that console. And I'll log in with the credentials that I was given on the command line. And this is my empty Kyma environment. Oh, is my audio still echoey? I don't know why my audio is echoey. I did a test beforehand, and of course the audio was fine. So I guess I'll have to look into that later. Sorry about that. But hopefully it's not too disturbing for everybody. So I'm on my Kyma console. This is an additional administrative console that gives us a lot of visibility into our Kubernetes cluster in general, but also allows us to see do some administration configuration specifically to some of these other components. For instance, it lets us create serverless functions. It lets us wire up eventing. So it gives us a nice graphical interface to do a lot of these additional things that a basic Kubernetes, like the Minikube dashboard, would not give us out of the box. Okay. Just a couple of post-installation steps as we're nearly out of time. Well, actually, I didn't want to go to the help. I wanted to come here. One thing you want to be sure to do after you finish your installation is come into the settings and do a download of the kubeconfig file. Now, I've just downloaded this. I've already downloaded this once. I'm going to put it here in the same spot. And then there is an export command that you would run to, in fact, I have to go look it up. I don't have it memorized. I don't have to do it very often. Here, one of the tutorials. Export kubeconfig equals, and then the path to that file, and then your kubectl command line and your other Minikube features will route through some of the special configuration of Kyma itself. So, for instance, it will authenticate who you're using your Kyma user. So that's an important step if you're going to use the kubectl command line to interact with your system post-Kyma installation, as you want to pull down that kubeconfig so that you get connected properly. I think the only other things that we want to talk through is I do have this running now. The last thing I wanted to do is talk about a little tip and trick. I've got Kyma installed, and that's about as far as I wanted to get today. On the next show, I'd like to maybe take you through one of the first tutorials, and we can do it together on the live stream, and I can talk through some of the background and some of the additional concepts of what we're doing there. But this was obviously necessary to get us to the point where we can have a local environment, maybe encourage you to maybe set up your own local development environment. And then next week, you can follow along with me when we go through one of the first tutorials. But one of the little tricks that I found that, yes, when you're done developing, you can do a Minikube stop, and then when you restart it, there are commands. You do a provision command again, and it takes a little bit to start up. What I found is really useful, particularly with Hyper-V, is when I'm done developing, and maybe I want to shut down my machine or switch to bring up another VM and I need to free up memory or something like that, is I just do a save. And this is like taking just a snapshot of the state of that VM. And that way I can restore back the state of my entire Minikube environment. And it only takes maybe 10 or 15 seconds to restore the state. And it gets back to the same running state. And I don't have to do a reprovision or run the risk that maybe my IP address changes or something like that. And it ends up disturbing my Minikube Kubernetes environment. I've had really good success with just doing the save and then restart from the saved image and never really shutting down Minikube. So just a little tip and trick there for operating in this environment. Maybe I'll look here. Yes, I know the audio is a reoccurring joke at this point. I don't know why it works perfectly fine in the pre-show test, and then when I get on the actual stream, it doesn't work. Definitely have to play around with that later this week. So I've got a really nice audio setup, and then it's just a shame if it's kind of echoey because of some weird software setting or something. So I'll definitely work on that. A simple question, I'm looking at everything installed. What size of computer? Oh, very good question. That was at the very beginning. It was here on the screen, but maybe I didn't call it out. Let me install. So if you go to the Kyma project, installation, install Kyma locally, if you're going to install Minikube and Kyma, and it does a light version of Kyma, then they recommend 4-core CPU and 8 gigs of RAM. Okay, and that's what I've, if you do the base configuration, that's what you get by default. And if I go back here to my Hyper-V, I'll go ahead and bring up the settings. You'll see that's exactly what I have configured here for virtual processors. 8 gigs of memory, that's what the default installer does. And I've had good experience with that. So this is a pretty reasonable amount of resources needed. I think most people's laptops probably have that pretty free. I mean, it would be good if maybe you have 12 or 16 gigs of memory, so you can give 8 to this VM. You could probably squeeze by, VMs will be a little forgiving if it can't get all of that from physical memory to do some swapping. I obviously do have more memory on my machine, but I think you could run this environment with a pretty reasonable amount of hardware. So anybody interested in giving it a try? Yeah, you don't need my massive 64 gigs of memory to run this development environment. Yeah, so when I do I think the question there saves memory allocated in Minikube. When I do the saved, it frees up the CPU, it frees up the assigned memory, and it only writes a disk image. So it's only taking up hard drive space and doesn't take up any physical RAM. So it's like hibernating the VM, if you will. So frees up most of the resources, yeah, it's a good way to sort of pause the VM. But yeah, doing a save as opposed to running here. Doing a save as opposed to a pause. If you do a pause in Hyper-V, that will still hold the memory, but stop the VM. But if you do a save, that will write the memory state to a file on your hard drive, but then free the memory. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That seems to be most of the questions that we have here today. I will post in the notes of today's live stream, I will post the links to a lot of the installers and web pages and stuff that I went to today, so you can get those links very easily out of the notes. I will also post the full installation video that you can watch in all of its wonderful glory of watching wait times and everything, and I'll link that over here as well. And as I said, in our next episode, we'll go to the next step. Now that we have a development environment, that's just step one. Now we need to learn how to use that development environment and learn what some of these things are. What is Kyma? What is Istio? What is Knative? And I think the best way to do that is do some development. We obviously have to get to a point where we have a development environment set up to do it in. So this is step one. Next episode, next week, we'll continue. And we will do a tutorial where we'll create some content, deploy it, configure it, and I think you'll get an even better sense of exactly what Kyma is and what development in this environment is like. Until then, thanks for joining the ABAP Freak Show, and we'll see you again with the next episode.